First thing we want to talk for sure is that you probably all of you, because you're old Flutter enthusiasts, right? So you've seen many of these examples, which I don't need to show you anymore again. So let's save some time and go to the main topics. You see that we can do a lot of stuff with Flutter, but Flutter Web particularly is really good for creating a single page application mostly, or converting that to a progressive web app, or basically the apps that you have, like a mobile application. It's behind the login authentication, like a dashboard style, and then you want to actually have your user also use a web version of that, right? So in this talk, we're going to talk about quickly to just be on the same page, progressive web app characteristic. We're going to talk about service worker and web app manifest, how Flutter is taking advantage of these two technologies to build progressive web app. And at the end, how you can extend service worker for Flutter application, which you can do a bunch of more advanced patterns, which is not supported by Flutter itself, but you can do that. So I was introduced very well for sure. My name is Majid, and I am a Flutter community leader and do a bunch of things for Flutter and and communities in general. And I'm also a passionate software engineer, just like you. My role at the moment is solution architect in Norway, one of the countries. You can find me on internet, perhaps if you search my name or find this handler. I'm almost everywhere. You can find me everywhere. Let's be in touch if and have more conversation later together. So he talked about Flutter Vikings. It's coming 3rd and 2nd of February, like around 10 days. Spoiler alert, we're gonna have so many cool stuff. Make sure that you're joining, because or you grab your free ticket. We're gonna have a 3D, a virtual space, networking, and a bunch of things that you have not probably seen in online conferences. That's the first time, at least in Flutter community, I'm doing this. So hopefully you will enjoy it. But let's talk about PWA. PWA are known as a reliable, fast, engaging web application, where they are resonating with native application. They're like giving the user native experience. For example, a feature like offline capability of a web application, which always was a case for mobile application, but now you can do it together with service worker and cache storage. You can do it with service work with PWAs. There are a bunch of APIs, the JavaScript APIs or browser APIs that you can also use in PWAs. Like you can connect even to hardware such as USB and Bluetooth, BLE, and stuff like that. So it's a lot of things that you can do with PWAs. They are fairly popular and powerful. So, but two important aspect of that. I think I'm freezed again. Oh, now I'm back. So, two important aspect of PWAs, or like the main skeleton of the PWAs, are service workers and web app manifests, right? So let's talk about service worker. A service worker is actually a background a script that is running in the browser. It's acting like a proxy. So it's just like sitting between your application and network or cache. Whenever a request or response goes and comes, you can catch an intercept and actually do something with it. And it comes with a life cycle. It comes with an installer life cycle, and then it becomes active, where you can, what, for example, clean up your cache and do some stuff over there. And then it goes to ideal. Then you can listen to events such as fetch and background things and things like that. So that the this is purely JavaScript things, right? So you generate a JavaScript file, a service worker file, where you can listen. If you have done any JavaScript before, you must be familiar with add listen event listener. So you can listen to install, active, and fetch events, for example, and do something with it. And here is an example. You need to definitely use fetch API in order to be able to fetch or catch or intercept the request and respond in service worker. So that's very important. And Flutter does that behind the scenes for you. So you don't need to worry about that part. So let's talk about caching API. So in Service Worker, you have a cache storage that you can open with some kind of name, and then you can actually add static assets or request and respond to this cache. So this is very powerful API that is provided in the browsers. So in fact, if you have a fetch request, for example, this is just purely, service worker script right now. So you can actually intercept your request and respond with something. So you can manipulate your request. This is very important to understand that you can manipulate your request. That's the power of service worker. So, and one of the things you can do is different cache strategy. You can say, hey, whenever a request, I'm requesting like a CSS file, I'm requesting a JavaScript file. Whenever this request comes, well, cache only strategy is one of the strategies. You can say, hey, can you just always match my request from the cache and return that? You don't go over network anymore. It's just always from cache, right? These are one of the strategies. Or you can do the other way around. You can say, hey, every time I have a request, always fetch. I don't need cache. It's network only strategy and a bunch of other strategies here. So definitely take your time after my talk, go to the slides, take a look at these examples and see how these strategies work. You have cache pairs falling back for network, you have network pairs, and if it's failing, then you can actually fall back to cache. And you have actually race, you can have also cache with network updates, like every time you can have the newest version of your request to the cache. These are the strategies. So take a look at that and you will learn something from it. Another thing that PWA comes with is web app manifest, right? It's a JSON file. It's a JSON text file where you can define your mostly a UI or theming of your application. So you define your a splash screen, logo, background, name, and theme color and stuff like that. So it can be like a web manifest suffix, or it can be a JSON file where Flutter actually comes with a manifest.json file. You will find it in index under the web folder. So definitely there are a bunch of properties there. It's not a rocket science here, so I don't need to explain all of this. So you can, by even reading these properties, you understand what it does. It's very simple, the app manifest, but you can test this manifest when you have it already in your application. You can open up your application in the browser, go to the application tab. In the manifest tab, you get all of these properties for you. You can see if it's something that you're looking into or not. That's just for debugging purposes. But let's talk about Flutter. We all know that the fact behind Flutter Web is like Dart to JS is kind of taking care of these, possibilities, right? So it's as well. That means you can even write maybe your service worker if you want. You can do a community things, do that, and compile it to JavaScript and open source so that people can use it. But quickly, if you want to explore the web folder, you will see that you're going to have manifest.json, you're going to have index, uh, index.html, for example, where you can find most of the scripting over there. So if you open the index.html, you'll find where Flutter is installing or registering the service worker and also loading the main Dart.js file, like the main file, the main bundle file for Flutter Web. So here is the script that you will find. Pretty straightforward. It will register the service worker. That the name of service worker in Flutter, if you see in line 1, it's Flutter service worker.js. So this is the name that is automatically created for you. So the scripting over there is automatically generated by Flutter, right? So you have a bunch of things that well, Flutter will take care of that for you. For example, adding the static assets to the cache for the subsequent reload can be much faster that because they're coming from cache. These are the things, or revalidating them, or reactivating the service worker every time you change your application. And all of this stuff is taken care by Flutter, right? I'm not going to talk about this, but what I'm going to talk about is that how you can now leverage or extend these the service worker that is generated by Flutter, and you don't have any control over it at all. But let's take a look at the service worker file which is generated. Now, this is the one that I built. So actually, I was supposed to demo this, but we don't. 20 minutes is actually not that much time that I can demo. So that's why I put everything in the slides. So look at this. I built this application under the build folder. Then I have Flutter Service Worker JS, right? So take a look at this file. You see that you have a list of resources. These are the assets that you see with the hash code, which means that if the file is changing, the hash code is changing. Therefore, the cache in the next load will be updated. So this is the way that Flutter is taking care of the caching updates for you, right? So they added all of these, static assets, which is generated for your Flutter web. And the way that it works, that then on install event, which we already talked about it, this is the life cycle of, service worker registration. The first event is install event. Then they're gonna actually add these requests to the cache. All of these static assets, right? The resources that you want to load later. And in an activate mode, you see that this is again an auto-generated script by Flutter team that is taking care of deleting the cache and updating the cache in an activate mode. So make sure that when service worker is taking over the page, you already have the updated resources, the assets, and a bunch of other things that Flutter does. For example, if on the fetch request, they are taking care of caching your URLs, for example, whether you are using hash bang strategy or other strategies, they taking care of, the uh, page, the request of each page, and they're taking care of the caching of those. So the script is fairly simple, and that's why when you're loading your application, a web application, you definitely see an install app. And that's because the Flutter web comes with both service worker as well as the web app manifest. So for those platforms that support installing, service worker on the home screen, for example, Chrome on Mac OS or on Android, so you will see this pop up. You can actually install your application on home screen, and you can even debug a service worker. You see that service worker is taking over, and that's exactly the service worker for this application that I built, right? And if you look at the cache under the browser's cache storage in application tab in the developer tools for Chrome, you will find your caches that are open and added the request and respond to them by service worker, which is generated again and created by Flutter team, right? So now you can actually read all of these requests and see the response. And that's the reason when you don't have internet, when you second time come to this application, the application will work out of the box. But now how can you extend this service worker? What if you don't want this auto-generated service worker? What if you want to cache your APIs? What if you want to cache your Google fonts? What if you want to cache a bunch of other things that you don't have access to the service worker by Flutter? Well, here is the things. JavaScript environment, JavaScript, PWA in JavaScript world comes with a great library called Workbox. A Workbox.js is a set of tools that helps you to uh, uh, create or generate your service worker like very, very easy. And it's a very powerful tools, right? Well, the first thing that you can do here is that you can install these. You need to have Node and npm. I know, like you're using Dart and you may want to write service worker in Dart and stick to the Dart ecosystem, there is no such a things at the moment, but spoiler alert again, I'm working on such a things. Hopefully in Q1 or Q2 2022, we will have a Dart version of this. Hopefully next presentation in a couple of months, we don't need to say npm install. I can say pop get workbox CLI or something like that. Hopefully that will happen. But as of now, we need to stick to the npm ecosystem. Let's install this CLI, work by CLI globally. If you run then the box command line, then you're gonna see that you will have a bunch of ways of generating service worker. You have a wizard way, you have generate service worker, you have inject manifest, which you need to pass some kind of configuration. We're gonna stick to the inject manifest. Let's create our workbox dash config plus swa.js in the root of our Flutter application. This is two JavaScript file, right? And in my workbox config file, I will define what I want to do. Fairly simple. I'm going to say that, hey, my directory that I'm looking into the static assets is build folder. That's after Flutter build is done, right? And then I say, hey, I want all of the JSON fonts. Let's take a look at the file a little bit closer. JSON fonts, JavaScript, WASM file, PNGs, JPEGs, HTML, everything. All these patterns, I want to add them to the cache. And my service worker is located in the root of folder sw.js. My destination is build web service worker. That's where I want to generate my service worker, or workbox can do that. And I can also say, well, add even 10 megabit of WASM file, for example, to the cache. I don't mind, add it. So a limit there. So, well, because I don't want to actually stick to the npm or build pipeline of npm and JavaScript word, I'm gonna use import script instead of importing my package locally from npm. I'm gonna say import my workbox swjs from HTTP request from Google Storage API. That's a Google thing, by the way. So, and then I'm gonna import or I'm gonna actually destructure my pre-cache and route, which is one thing that is coming with this workbox. And the easiest part is that I can say pre-cache and route, please self.web manifest as a const here, and that's something workbox will take care for you. The whole things that I've written right now, that will generate after running this command. Let's look at this. Let's see how easy is this library. That will generate entire things that Flutter team is also generating for you for static asset caching. Flutter, you need to first make sure that you do not generate your Flutter web with service worker. And that's for that, you need to pass PWA strategy none, where it's going to unregister or remove the service worker file for you. And then you need to run workbox command line, inject manifest, and pass your configuration, which I just spoke about, right? Then the JavaScript file that you defined in the config file will be generated, and Workbox will automatically detect all the static assets that you defined in the pattern and then add them to the resource, which will be added to the cache in the install event. And every time you do a different, version and the hashing will be different, then it will be updated during the active event. So this part is completely done. Simply you replace this Flutter service worker, but now you have a bunch of other things that you can do. Last thing that you need to do before we move on to the next slide is make sure that in index.html, you replace Flutter service worker.js with sw.js. The sw.js is going to be your service worker that you are taking care of that. And let's see now what you can do in maybe 1 minute. All the ideas that you can do. Look at this. First, you can add Google Analytics for offline, tracking. So it's simple. It's coming from a workbox out of the box. You can just destructure it and use it. That's everything is going to be taken care of by Workbox. You can register different routing because routing means requests, right? So then you can register different routing and add routing requests to cache with different strategies. This is the file that I have in my root of Flutter project, right? I can say, hey, I have a Google font. Please add them to cache. I have a fonts.js static. This is something that you cannot do with Flutter Web, but here you can do. You can actually say, this is my origin, add them to cache. I always want these fonts coming from cache. Cache first strategy, but you can also expire them with some threshold, right? So, or maybe you have an API. What if you have a Hacker News API? You can say, hey, this is my Hacker News API. Whenever I call this, yeah, that's going to be a get request. Register this route, add them to cache to the stories cache, and then inspire. You will have a like a offline version of a stories. If your app doesn't work, like you don't have network requests, the API still will return some response for you from the cache. And maybe a bunch of other things. Maybe you can do a modal, like whenever a register. This is actually something that I've written. You can actually look at this code later. What it does is that whenever there is a new registered service worker, it will show up a pop-up on your homepage of Flutter application and say, hey, a new service worker is registered. Do you want to reload your application? Because you need to reload, that service worker can take over. Then you reload your application, for example, and that is going to simply add the service worker which is taking over the whole pages. These are the things that is hard to do, like with the built-in feature of Flutter. Or you can even pass messages between index.html and Flutter or service worker. You can do a bunch of things here. You can pass something else from the messaging, and then you can do something with that. This is actually the pop-up, like you can do. You can definitely make it better and nicer. But this is a pop-up that is coming. It says a new version of application is loading. Do you want to reload? And you can actually do that. And imagine that you are using Navigator 2, which is coming with this nice routing for web, nested routing, child routing, and then you have a bunch of things. You can cache all of them and make your application fully offline. So unfortunately, again, I couldn't have time to just show you a demo, but you will get definitely an access to the slides and some source codes that you can go and check it out. By now, you know the fundamentals of PWA, some strategies, service worker manifest, and caching strategies, and you also know how you can remove a built-in Flutter service worker and replace it with some service worker that you can take it over and do whatever you want with that service worker. Be careful, service worker is powerful, but at the same time, it can be dangerous. So caching, that is one of the hardest things in computer science, right? So always be careful what you're doing. Test a lot before you ship to your customer. So with that said, here is the slides. So you can go to my slides.com/myhandler, MHA Daily. You'll find all of my slides, including this one and other PWA talks, as well as Flutter talks. So you can find all of them, take advantage of all of them. And you can also find source code under my GitHub. I have a bunch of examples for that. You can find them on my GitHub. Again, same handler on GitHub. And here's my Twitter if you want to keep in touch. Any question, I'll be happy to answer. And I think I'm right on time, hopefully. I spoke very fast. I'm sorry for that. But that is mostly for inspiration. So hopefully I inspired you to go and take over your service worker and take advantages of that.